Good morning. Well, this is the last lecture of the semester. So I'm waiting for the cheering now to die down, but you can hear that through the electronics here. Last lecture of the semester and the lecture that I have just written in the last few weeks. A lecture, frankly, I'm not looking forward to giving because it seems to me that no matter what I say, that I'm bound to offend everyone in the class at some point during this lecture. I've tried in the writing of this lecture and in the delivering, and they're not always one and the same thing, but I've tried in the writing of a lecture to keep myself bound by the facts as opposed to my political philosophy. That said, that is essentially impossible to do, at least at a perfect level. And so I'm quite certain that my selection of the facts or even an intonation of my voice will at some point irritate everybody in the class. So if I say something that's irritating or you disagree with, wait just a few minutes and I will almost assuredly irritate and bring up a point that that is unacceptable to the other side of the equation. This is the nature of history of recent events, very recent events. Now, the closer we get to the present day and the more important the event is, the more likely we are to feel passionate about that event. Nevertheless, it is the purpose of the historian then to try to present as objectively as possible what happened and to try to make some sense of it for the future. So, without further explanations then, the election of 2016, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, a pox on both your houses. In 2016, the United States was in the 8th year of Barack Obama's historic presidency. Obama was the first African American to be elected president of the United States. He had guided the American people out of the Great Recession. The economic recovery that he helmed had been slow, but very sure. When he left office, America was prosperous, and Americans were relatively happy. His signature accomplishment was a comprehensive healthcare program known as Obamacare. Obamacare sought to increase affordable access to healthcare for all Americans. It controlled escalating healthcare costs, expanded Medicaid, and required adult Americans to get coverage, to get healthcare coverage, or pay a fine. And it made health insurers accept all patients regardless of pre-existing conditions. The fine associated with the so-called individual mandate, requiring Americans to purchase health care for themselves or pay the fine, was repealed in 2017 by a Republican-controlled Congress. The mandate itself, the requirement, remains part of the law. It's just there's no fine associated with it now. In 2016, presidential election year, Democrats nominated Hillary Clinton to be their choice for the presidency. Clinton had a long resume in public service. She is the wife of Bill Clinton, President of the United States from 1993 to 2001. As First Lady, Hillary was very active in her husband's conduct of the office of the president, perhaps the most active and most political First Lady in our history. Indeed, she led his efforts to improve healthcare in the United States. In 2001, she was elected a U.S. Senator from the state of New York. And during the Obama presidency, she was Secretary of State from 2009 to 2013. From her resume alone, Few Americans were more prepared to be president of the United States. Republicans in 2016 were in disarray. The party was in disarray. There was a wild primary campaign that shocked the nation. Billionaire businessman and television celebrity Donald Trump emerged to win the nomination of the Republican Party. Much of the nation, including a large number of Republicans, were dismayed by this development. Trump was the opposite of Clinton in terms of his preparation for the presidency, and it must be noted that this is one of the charms of Donald Trump, that he wasn't a member of the political establishment. He had never held public office. He did have experience of the world in terms of how business, how the economy worked, and he did understand how government regulations impacted the economy both at home and abroad. But it was not his lack of experience that predisposed many Americans to reject him, as much as it was his lack of sexual morality, exacerbated by his unsophisticated manner of speech. So why did Trump win the Republican nomination and ultimately defeat Hillary Clinton in one of the great upsets in American political history? This is the question that today, on the eve of another presidential election, the Democratic Party has struggled to answer. Donald Trump appealed to American voters who believed the country was headed in the wrong direction. For them, it was becoming too liberal in its social policies. Obamacare was Exhibit A, but there were many other examples. So Trump campaigned on the repeal of Obamacare. More importantly, both political parties had adopted a globalist perspective regarding America's place in the world, as opposed to a nationalist perspective. So I shall explain now what globalism is. This is absolutely essential to understand this if you're going to make intelligent choices in the world today and to understand the world that you live in. Globalism. What is globalism? It is the idea that as technology makes the world smaller, we communicate with the rest of the world much more quickly. We even travel to other parts of the world much more quickly than we ever have been able to do before. That in this new world of technological advancements, nation states are less important. Indeed, it may be, according to the globalist perspective, that nation states are even negative influences on world prosperity and on world peace. Since the end of the Second World War in 1945, both political parties represented the view of America's great global businesses. Now we're talking about the American businesses who have a global reach. So in the old-fashioned economy, you can think of Coca-Cola. In the more recent technological economy, you can think of Microsoft and Apple and so forth. These are America's great global businesses. They sell products all over the world. And the proponents of these businesses and their political allies believe that greater profits were to be had if barriers to trade, tariffs, regulations were eliminated and nations allowed to trade freely with one another. Now, there is significant merit to this view. There were considerable negative results in the United States, on the other hand, when this free trade globalist perspective became the operating principle of both political parties in the country. Specifically, with few tariffs in place and few trade regulations regulating international trade, American corporations began building factories in places where wages were dramatically less than they were here in the United States. So in other words, American global corporations began exporting American jobs. Mexico, South Korea, and later China began to produce in these new American factories, that is, factories that were producing American goods, began to produce the goods for Americans rather than Americans themselves. Again, gradually, the American manufacturing sector, the old industrial economy, otherwise known as blue-collar jobs, were being exported to other nations in order that the corporations then that were engaged in this practice could make more money. And so American manufacturing jobs, blue-collar jobs, declined. America became a service economy rather than an industrial or manufacturing economy. And unemployment became a problem for industrial workers, for, again, blue-collar workers. Essentially, American business people and the federal government sacrificed the jobs of Americans for greater profit. No wonder these Americans were upset. Another economic problem impacting the same type of worker came as a result of the environmental movement in the United States and, frankly, in the world. The timber industry was dramatically curtailed over environmental issues, while the same thing would happen to coal mining and other extraction industries. It seemed that America's urban elites, that is, the elites, the highly educated, well-to-do people who live in the cities, and frankly, these elites of both political parties, were making economic war on their own working class people. People who often lived in small towns and in the country. They were essentially out of sight and therefore out of mind if you live in the big city. Indeed, many of these elites saw the interior of the country, where these jobs were traditionally located, as flyover country, space that had to be covered while one traveled to the important places of the nation on the two coasts, largely, although there are exceptions, Chicago in the middle of the country, Dallas-Fort Worth in northern Texas. But essentially, the middle of the country was flyover country. The important places in the minds of these peoples, whether it was conscious or subconscious, were on the coast, Silicon Valley in California, the home of many of the tech industries, Seattle, Washington, where Microsoft and Amazon and a number of other major companies are located, Boeing, for example. Or I should say Boeing used to be located in Seattle. Much of the manufacturing for Boeing is still there, but they moved their corporate headquarters to Chicago. Then, of course, there's Wall Street in New York and then Washington, D.C. on the East Coast as well. Well, the only surprising thing about the rebellion of working class Americans against this system, this establishment, against the globalist worldview, was that they waited until 2016 to express their frustration. But this had been building for decades. Which brings us then to the presidential campaign of 2016. There were many issues in the 2016 campaign. The most important were healthcare, blue-collar factory jobs, industrial jobs, immigration, or I should say illegal immigration, taxes, and personal character. Moreover, excuse me, the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, ran on the idea of repealing Obamacare. Throughout the campaign, his number one issue, it seemed to many anyway, was to repeal Obamacare. Many Americans were unhappy that this program required them to purchase health care. This was something that had never been the case in America before. No one had ever been required to purchase health care. Moreover, many of these Americans were forced to change their doctors. Forced to change their doctors in spite of the fact that President Obama had personally assured them that they would not have to do so. Hillary Clinton ran on the idea of expanding Obamacare, that is, increasing it. In regard to blue-collar jobs, Trump promised to bring those jobs back to America. How would he do that? Well, by the use of tariffs to punish imported goods coming from other countries that cost less than American-made goods. So you put a tariff on an imported good, and that raises the cost of that good, and then American goods made in this country then have may have, in fact, a price advantage relative to the imported good that has to pay a tariff. At any rate, it would more equalize the prices. This, combined with regulations and tax penalties against moving jobs overseas, appealed to many working-class Americans. Trump also advocated tax reductions for businesses in America. All of those measures were designed to bolster the American economy, to make American businesses more profitable. Hillary Clinton argued for the status quo. She argued for the status quo when she bothered to address the problem at all. It simply was not on her agenda with her globalist perspective. Working class Americans were not part of the globalist agenda. She was one of those politicians who referred to the places where many of these jobs were located, middle America, rural America, small towns. She referred to them as flyover country, as many of the especially liberal elites, but not just the liberal elites, did. She also, and this was a tremendous political mistake, she also called people who supported Trump deplorables. Within a matter of hours, having said that, Americans who supported Trump had T-shirts that declared that they were deplorables, proudly declaring their deplorable status. So no wonder these Americans, many of whom had relied on the Democratic Party in the past, the Democratic Party had been the party of working class Americans throughout most of its history. But now it seems to have abandoned the Democrats who had given it such loyal support in the past. So no wonder these Americans did not trust Hillary Clinton. Illegal immigration, especially at our southern border with Mexico, was perhaps the most emotional issue. Although I must say that factory jobs and so forth, and decline of the industrial sector in America was a very emotional issue. Democrats had changed their position on illegal immigration over the previous decade and a half or so. It seemed to many that they grew unconcerned about illegal immigration and the drug trafficking and sex trade that came along with illegal immigration. Infatuated with globalism, many Democrats in the tradition of Karl Marx, not suggesting that the Democrats are Marxist, but there is a tradition here that I'm referencing, so be careful with my words here. Many Democrats, thus in the tradition of Karl Marx, envisioned a world that no longer featured nation states, but had become a global village. Obviously, this meant no borders. You can't have a nation state if you don't have any borders, and vice versa. Democrats were impressed with this development in the European Union. The decrease of the significance of nation states, that is borders, in the European Union, in the EU. There, nation states were gradually losing their relevance. Even more importantly, Democrats hoped that illegal immigrants might one day be given citizenship in the United States, and thus, gaining citizenship, would have the vote. Democrats knew that these immigrants, when they did get the vote, voted overwhelmingly Democratic. Thus, illegal immigration might one day make the Republican Party obsolete. Of course, illegal immigrants swamped our social structure, especially in the southwestern states, and competed for jobs with lower class, working class Americans. But Democrats by this time did not seem to be concerned with the plight of working class Americans. Donald Trump promised to reduce taxes for most Americans, especially the middle class. He was also concerned with the corporation tax rate because it was higher than most other countries, not higher than all, but higher than many other countries. And so American corporations paying American taxes were at a disadvantage relative to foreign companies. Their cost of doing business in terms of the tax structure was less. Indeed, one of the reasons American corporations moved overseas was to avoid high American corporate taxes. Again, the Democrats were for raising taxes, especially on corporations, which would only have encouraged more and more corporations to move overseas. A pox on both your houses. The personal character of both candidates was a significant issue. Donald Trump was notorious for his sexual immorality and, frankly, his distant relationship with the truth. Then, too, that he had made, lost, and remade his vast fortune, combined with the fact that he was most well known for his role as a television reality show host, did not recommend him to voters who take character and political experience seriously. Hillary Clinton had significant character issues herself. Many Americans remember that she and her husband, former President William Clinton, had been accused of serious financial improprieties, though never proven. The stigma remained. So the fact I'm referencing here is not that they were guilty of anything, but that the idea that they were guilty is what remained in the minds of many American voters. Then, during the campaign, allegations regarding her lackadaisical care of government secrets while she was Secretary of State surfaced. Again, no charges were brought, but the fear that she was unreliable and probably had covered up the malfeasance in her office, again, this is what people thought, those fears, those thoughts were real. Finally, and this is just being brutally honest, it must be said that many Americans, no way to know how many, because people will not generally admit to this, but it must be said that some Americans were not ready for a woman to be president of the United States. The election of 2016. Donald Trump won the election of 2016 because he won states that traditionally voted for Democrats, states that Hillary Clinton depended upon to win the presidency. So the question is, why did Donald Trump win those states? The accusation that Democrats made then and to this day was that the Russians had illegally influenced the election of 2016 in favor of Donald Trump. For whatever reason, the Russians, according to this theory, believed that Donald Trump would be a president that would be more friendly to them than Hillary Clinton would be. Moreover, not only did the Russians illegally influence our election, but that Donald Trump knew about it and was engaged in a conspiracy to see this happen. So this Trump-Russia conspiracy, combined with the Democrats' belief that the growing strength of their party lay with rapidly increasing immigrants and with a large generation known as millennials. This ideology, this belief meant that the Republicans might never win the presidency again. This is the hope. In short, and I don't think that Democrats think this, I think this is subconscious, but I believe there was a sense of entitlement, a sense of destiny among Democrats concerning this election. The first woman president, they hoped and believed, would follow the first Black president, and the liberal vision for the country would be firmly established. Assuming victory in the election, then, the Democrats hoped to establish a European-style welfare state in the United States that, if not in the first year or even in the first term of Hillary Clinton, would at least move towards open borders, government ownership of healthcare, and free college education. These things were on the agenda. And then the Democrats lost. How could this happen? They were shocked, stunned, and then enraged. And it must be said that Donald Trump is not a likable human being. In terms of his human qualities, he's not admirable. And so the unlikable Trump made an easy target. It was convenient to believe that he had stolen the election with Russian help. Equally important, he was everything that elitist Democrats and elitist Republicans, and make no mistake, there are elitist Republicans as well. He was everything these people despised. He was inarticulate. It's actually painful to watch Donald Trump speak in public for a person like me. He's imprecise in his rhetoric, prone to exaggeration, to not having his facts correct. He was wealthy, and he was clearly guilty of sexual misconduct. So that explains subsequent Democrat behavior, why they hated him. But it does not explain why they lost the election. The Democrats lost the election because they lost too many votes from working class Americans in what were traditionally Democratic states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Texas. Many of these states, the industrial heartland of the old industrial America, especially in the upper Midwest. Voter analysis in these states demonstrates the truth. Secure borders and more factory jobs, along with a revived fossil fuel industry in states where those jobs were crucial, moved enough voters, and just enough voters, from Clinton to Trump. In short, many voters almost literally held their noses when they went to the polls, because both candidates were personally unsavory. And these voters then, seeing that both candidates were in ways that perhaps no election before 2016, were the candidates so morally compromised in the eyes of most Americans. And so they voted for their own economic benefit instead of the Democratic Party's globalist welfare state. And so Donald Trump, again, to the shock and dismay of perhaps a majority of Americans, and there is even some evidence that Trump himself was shocked that he was elected. So Donald Trump is president of the United States. Now, Democrats do not argue that Donald Trump failed to deliver on his campaign promises. Quite the contrary. They argue that the promises themselves were either mistaken or even immoral. So Trump proceeded with the attempt to repeal Obamacare. This failed. He was not able to repeal Obamacare. The vote went to the Senate, a Senate controlled by Republicans, and the Republican majority refused to vote to repeal Obamacare. In regard to the promised tax cut, Trump delivered on the tax cut. Taxes for Americans who pay income taxes, and that's only about half the people in the country. If you're in the lower half of the people in terms of your annual income, you don't even pay any federal income tax. But Trump then delivers on reducing taxes, income taxes, for the American people. Lower middle class taxpayers benefited the most by percentage. That is, they got the larger percentage reduction in their taxes. It's very careful when looking at statistics about this that you compare apples to apples. Their income tax went down an average of 14.5%. But taxes for all Americans, and yes, even the wealthy, went down dramatically. And the corporate tax rate dropped from 35% to 21%, an enormous drop in the corporate tax rate. This then helped American corporations be more competitive with their foreign competitors. And it made it, it provided an inducement then for American corporations to bring jobs back home, that is, many of them being factory jobs. So this was part of the Trump promise regarding factory jobs. In the 3 years from Trump's accession to the presidency, the American economy added nearly 500,000 manufacturing jobs. This is not all jobs, this is simply manufacturing jobs. And manufacturing jobs tend to be very good paying blue collar jobs. And here is an important statistic. In the previous 24 years, millions of American manufacturing jobs were lost to overseas producers. So Trump reversed that and began bringing American jobs back home again. Here's a prediction that no matter who wins the next presidential election in 2020, whether it's Joe Biden or whether it's a re-election for Donald Trump, this trend in trying to reestablish American manufacturing will continue. I think this is one area where Donald Trump has moved the conversation to the point that the Democratic Party is going to seize on this and be concerned about manufacturing jobs, about working class Americans again. And not only was it Donald Trump who made this point, but Bernie Sanders, who was a representative of the more radical Democrats, was also making this point. So I think this argument, again, has captured the center of the, well, frankly, I think it's captured the attention and the support of the vast majority of Americans. So there was also, with the return of well-paying, high-paying middle-class jobs, a rise in middle-class wages. In the 2.5 years since his inauguration, wages for middle-class households are up over $5,000. $5,000. For middle-class households, that's a lot of money. President Trump also made good on increased border security. He began enforcing existing laws that Democrats had largely ignored. He increased border security forces, while many Democrats, frankly, called for the elimination of border enforcement. Most emotionally, most dramatically, he began construction of hundreds of miles of a new border wall that would aid Border Patrol agents in enforcing border security. Democrats impeach. From the day of his election, many Democrats, not all, but many, truly believed Trump was unfit to be president of the United States. And so some means had to be found to impeach him and remove him from office. Democrats were convinced that he had conspired, as I earlier explained, with Russians to swing the election in his favor. It was vastly more palatable to believe that Hillary Clinton had been unjustly deprived of the presidency by, frankly, a treasonous Donald Trump, than to believe her campaign had made incredible mistakes, especially ignoring working class Americans. For the next 2 years, Democrats waited. And they waited impatiently while Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller and his team investigated the whole Russian conspiracy, Trump collusion theory, the alleged Russian influence. Meanwhile, the mainstream media, the liberal media, told the American people that Trump was guilty and therefore illegitimate. It was just a matter of time when when the Mueller report came out, Trump would be impeached and removed from office. When the Mueller report was finally published in early 2019, and Mueller himself could not indict Trump on any charges, nor could the Democrats in Congress find anything in the Mueller report that they thought that it could use to impeach Donald Trump. Now Democrats were shocked. Even congressional leaders threw up their hands, as I just said. You could not use the report to impeach. Then, no sooner had this concluded, in July 2019, President Trump made a phone call to the leader of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Zelensky phone call, or the phone call. In the phone call, Trump implied that military aid would be withheld unless Ukraine launched an investigation into Joe Biden's activities in Ukraine on behalf of his son, Hunter's business interests there. Now, no arrangement was made between Trump and Zelensky did not launch an investigation. And the aid that Trump had implied might be withheld arrived on time. But on the other hand, Trump had clearly stated that he wanted Biden investigated and that there was some connection with the aid. Democrats argued that the president's behavior was an effort to illegally influence the US presidential election of 2020. Trump well knew that Joe Biden was likely to be a candidate, might even be the nominee. And so if he could find some evidence, or even just launching the investigation to find evidence in Ukraine, that would be a black mark against Biden. And so in February 2020, the Democrats, in control of the House of Representatives, voted to impeach the president. That simply means they voted to bring charges against the president. The House by itself cannot impeach the president and cannot remove the president. They simply began impeachment proceedings, and that's what they did. They voted 2 articles of impeachment: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. As almost everyone knew at the time, these charges were politically motivated for all of the reasons that I have already outlined. And these charges are so generic and so base that if a president were unpopular with the other party, these kinds of charges could be brought against any president. The Senate controlled by Republicans, refused to convict the president. Although I will say that Mitt Romney, the single Republican senator, did vote to convict. So one Republican switched sides and voted with the Democrats. Polls at the time, excuse me, polls showed that independent voters, that is, those voters who were not aligned either with the Democrats or the Republicans, believed that the impeachment was politically motivated. And they thought that it was essentially inappropriate. To them, the Trump threat to Zelensky to withhold aid did not, and they're not denying the fact that there was a threat, but that threat did not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. And many Republicans saw it that way as well. While the impeachment was taking place, new reports of a virus from Wuhan, China, began to appear in the nightly news and on cable news channels. Summary. The presidency of Donald Trump did not polarize Americans. Some political commentators believe that when President Trump leaves office, that we'll return to the, quote, harmonious society that we used to be. This is forgetting the recent past. Donald Trump's election indicated just how polarized Americans already were. And when he leaves office, Americans will not resume a harmonious civil society. For Americans are fundamentally at odds over what constitutes a civil society. At its very essence, Americans are divided over the most basic American values: freedom and equality. Increasingly, Democrats are devoted to equality, even economic equality, and are willing to sacrifice substantial freedoms so that government can mandate equality. Republicans, meanwhile, are increasingly devoted to freedom as they see traditional American freedoms constantly under attack. Particular flashpoints are freedom to keep the lion's share of one's earnings from ever-increasing taxation, freedom to bear arms, and freedom to stand for traditional American Christian values. These issues, once Trump leaves office, will not go away. They await some kind of fundamental resolution. Well, I thank you for your kind attention to this lecture. This concludes my lectures for the semester. So I pray for your success on the final exams. I wish you well, especially, well, I wish all students well, but I'm especially sending a well wish to those of you who are seniors who are graduating. So God be with you in every way.